Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today as co-host is Daniel McAdams.
Good morning, sir.
Daniel, good to see you. Well, the world is not as peaceful as we'd like it to be. It could be a lot worse, but there's always some stirrings around the world, and sometimes we get involved in a few of those things. And of course, our viewpoint is that we get involved way too much and we go looking for trouble, and too often we find it. All you have to do is think back these 15 years or more in the Middle East, and that's an ongoing crisis. But today in the news, there was several things going on. We're sending tanks to Georgia, you know, and we do that every year for a military exercise. At least we participate, but we've never sent tanks before. And we up the number of troops we sent over there. And I'm just not quite sure why that has much to do with defending our country. It seems like an aggravation. Also, they're getting ready to open up a defense shield in Romania. Now that's really important. We have to defend Romania. At the same time, antagonize somebody. Maybe the Russians might be antagonized by this because we're right close to their border. And there's the continuation with Baltic, the build-up in the military and our involvement throughout that region, and our involvement in Ukraine and in that area. But today, the announcement is, the one headline says, U.S. warship challenges China's claim in the South China Sea. Well, sounds like it's pretty important. Seems like it's a long way off. I'd like to put that up on the map just to show the audience exactly what we're talking about. And I want to make a point of who's directly involved with the South China Sea and why we're sending the third warship over there to stir up some problems as far as I can see. But there we go. China, of course, is a so-called instigators now because they're developing some new islands there and claiming it's part of China. The Philippines are involved because they have territorial disputes. Brunei is involved. Malaysia is involved. Vietnam is involved. Actually, Japan is involved as well as Taiwan. But we're the big guys, and we have to go over there. And, you know, they're talking about military, but maybe there's some economic interest that we have to deal with, too, in this little dispute.
Yeah, the U.S. claims that, China has begun developing the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea we just saw on the map. And they have reclaimed some of these islands, some of this small atoll, to make an airstrip that they're using now. And this has got the U.S. up in arms because it would extend their territorial claims into the South China Sea. So the U.S. claims that this could threaten shipping lanes, so we've got to go ahead and send the U.S. Navy over there to challenge these claims. But as you point out, these shipping claims are very, very significant. $5 trillion worth of shipborne trade passes through that area every year. And that includes a lot of China trade, as you can imagine. That includes the backbone of the Chinese economy, you could say.
You'd think that would be enough of an incentive to work toward peace rather than working toward antagonisms here.
It's hard to imagine the Chinese would cut off their nose to spite their face and say, no more trade in the South China Seas.
And the third ship to send over there is the USS William Lawrence, which is a destroyer, and maybe we can get a picture up of that to show the significance of this. This is not like a diplomatic inquiry. I mean, this is intimidation and threat. So this is important stuff because not so much that they're going to deliberately start shooting at each other, but sometimes accidents happen, and that's, and sometimes there's false flags, and things get stirred up. Right now, it doesn't look like that's what China's intent is. I think they're expressing themselves, and it's a regional discussion, but I don't think they want to have any conflict over this, especially with the amount of trade involved.
Well, it is a regional dispute, and I think it's fair to say that China is trying to establish some facts on the ground by doing this. But, the irony, and you could almost say a little bit of hypocrisy, the U.S. is furious that China is objecting to the USS William Lawrence traveling within 12 miles of what they claim is their territory. And the U.S. claims that China's excessive maritime claims are inconsistent with the law of the sea treaty. So we're using this UN treaty to say China is really going beyond. But the irony is, of course, that the U.S. has refused, and rightly so, but refused to ratify the law of the sea treaty, so we're not even part of it, yet we want it to apply to all these other countries.
Is that similar to the World Criminal Court? Sometimes we want to prosecute people under the World Court, International Court. At the same time, we don't sign it or say that we will abide by it.
We're exceptional.
Yeah,
It
that
doesn't
is.
count for us.
But you know, there was a think tank that put out a paper on this, and actually the headline was misleading because it said Chinese ambitions in South China Sea must be resisted, think tank says. But then when I read the article, they came up with a different statement, which actually admitted that China was actually backing away from an aggressive approach. And the technical terms that they use is that they have been in that region practicing something called tactical aggression, and they're replacing it with passive assertive action. Those are technical things, but the writer of the article said, well, actually, they're setting the stage. If there's any argument, any dispute, thinking $5 trillion of trade, this is how we want to resolve it, which means that we probably shouldn't have and don't need the United Nations, and we don't need the United States being the arbiter of a conflict like this.
Yeah, you know, and according to UN law, the countries have the right to, quote, innocent passage through these waters as long as it's no threat to the sovereignty, peace, or security of the country along the coast. So China claims that, you know, putting a fully loaded warship within this really violates that because you can't say it's not a threat to the sovereignty and peace. So the question would be, if the U.S. wants to assert these maritime claims, why not put a commercial ship, you know, with some containers or something representing trade? Why have a fully loaded military ship in the region?
Yeah, and the supporters of us being there are going to say, freedom of the seas, nobody else is going to protect it, and we have to do it. But our argument about the bilateral and regions dealing with these problems has a pretty good history of success, because I remember my concerns in college in 1956, because I always knew there would be a draft, and I always assumed I would be drafted. And in '56, I thought I was going to be drafted over the Suez Canal incident. But here, Israel and the British and the French decided that they were not going to turn the canal over to Egypt. So there was a major conflict, a major waterway, a lot more major than this. So Eisenhower, you know, was asked to come in and save the day and make sure that the British and the French could maintain that canal. And he just refused to do it. But it finally got settled. There was no war, and the parties were there. And although Eisenhower was involved sometimes with intrigue and behind the scenes on foreign policy issues, in this case, and this was generally his argument, not to get into the armed conflict. And so he avoided that. But also, I think we might even compare how Crimea was settled. You know, that's a property dispute, a borders dispute, and Russia has their arguments. And you know, by us not being involved any more than we were, of course we were involved way too much anyway, actually those boundaries are pretty well set right now, and it didn't require the United Nations. It had to rebuke really NATO in some way, because we were with NATO trying to dictate to them. So things can work out when the parties who have the biggest interest, and I think more of that should have been applied to the Middle East too, rather than us dictating boundaries in the Middle East ever since World War I, which I think is a source of so many problems there.
Well, then one of the problems is that the U.S. is, I think, pursuing the same strategy with regard to China in the South China Sea as it is toward Russia in Europe and elsewhere in the Caucasus, which is to surround Russia with bases and satellite countries. You know, we have countries that are in NATO, like the Baltic countries, that are essentially outposts of U.S. military power. And the same is happening in the South China Sea. We have the U.S. now going back into the Philippines and reestablishing military bases there after we left them after the Cold War. We have the U.S. trying to do the bidding of the other countries in the region. So the U.S. comes in and says, don't worry, little guys, we're going to give you the money, we're going to sell you the weapons, and we're going to protect you. But what it does is it provokes a reaction. I think that's what the William Lawrence was supposed to do, was to provoke a reaction from China, and it did. Very similar to what happened with Russia and the Baltics and the other U.S. ship China scrambled some jets and buzzed the Americans over there to send a message that you're in our territory. So it's the same kind of reaction that the U.S. is provoking. And I'm thinking it may be unintended consequences. What the effect of this has been is to push China and Russia much closer together and possibly hasten the collapse of the dollar as the world's currency.
Yeah, and which means that there's still a lot of risk there, even though the intent is to play war games. And that's a little bit more serious when you start buzzing ships and ships getting too close and to try to prove points. Because like I said, there can be an accident, there can be a problem, planes get shot down and who knows what. So it just doesn't make any sense. The American people should realize that our national defense, our national security has nothing to do with our compulsion to deal with this issue over there when the countries involved should be dealing with it. So I see this as such a strong negative.
Well, the Philippines, the expected winner of the Philippine elections that are upcoming, he has suggested multilateral talks with China. And China, of course, has refused that because that brings the U.S. into a dispute that China doesn't believe it has a place to deal with. So China believes that it should have bilateral talks with these countries. And frankly, because of how much money is involved, how much of the economies are involved, it's hard to believe they couldn't come to a more equitable solution to this part of the world without the U.S. coming in with warships and bullying and violating his territory.
You know, before we finish, I want to ask you a question, bring up a subject probably not too related by this, but it does involve our military-industrial complex because they got a neat contract the other day, $3 billion from the British, and of course, I think they're pretty close allies of ours. $3 billion to get 9 Poseidon submarine hunters. Now, that's good for Boeing. But for some reason, I can't help but think there's some shenanigans going on. But what national need for security to own these ships, these submarine hunters? Who's their enemy that they have to have these? I mean, this sounds like they're preparing for World War II or something.
Well, they have been, UK has been very aggressive toward Russia. But I remember what you always said when you were in the House, and it made a lot of sense, is that the military-industrial complex probably shouldn't be allowed to sell weapons to other countries, even allies, because all of these weapons were developed in technology that was subsidized by the American taxpayer. We pay all the R&D, we upfront all the cost of these, and then we socialize the costs, and then they privatize the profits.
So if this had been built by the market and didn't get our subsidies to a company like this and sweetheart deals, it might have cost them $6 billion, and of course the Brits wouldn't sell that, but they're indirectly related all the time. So I think that that is just another example of how outrageously expensive this is. I do want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and once again, stirring up trouble in the South China Sea, unnecessary, needless, and dangerous, and costly, has nothing to do with our national defense, and yet barely a word will be said. It takes a lot of searching to get information like this. It won't be on the evening news. The presidential candidates won't be required to take a position on this because everybody's for the freedom of the seas, and it's our obligation to protect it. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.